What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, and this is this week's old-time crime case. We're going to be talking about a man named Severin Klosowski, but he goes by the name George Chapman, so I'm just going to be referring to him as George throughout the entire video. George Chapman was a convicted murderer and also a Jack the Ripper suspect. So let's jump right in. Born on December 14th, 1855, a Sagittarius, in the city of Warsaw in the country of Poland. He was actually born in a small village near Warsaw, but I can't pronounce or spell the name, but it was very close to Warsaw. George's parents' names were Emily and Antonio Kozlowski, and his father was a carpenter and his mother a homemaker. His parents were kind of well-to-do for that time and very well respected in the community. His father did really great carpentry work, and because of this, he was able to instill in his son, in George, a really good work ethic from a very early age. George was known to be extremely smart and hardworking, and because of all of this, he was afforded the very rare opportunity of a good education. George was able to start attending school at a very young age, and although he quit school and stopped attending at the age of 14, he was somehow able to become a surgeon's apprentice. He was extremely talented in the areas of surgery, everything that he learned. He was such a fast learner. He was so skilled with the knife. He would have made an amazing doctor, amazing surgeon himself. However, he did end up receiving his license, or whatever it was called back then, to be a surgeon's apprentice. He finished school for that, and he was very well respected in the community in that job title, and he just did an amazing job. He was also really good with people, very charming, and he was on his way to a really great life. So after finishing his schooling for becoming a surgeon's apprentice in 1877, for unknown reasons, George left Poland and traveled to London, England to start his new life there. London at the time was known, at least as far as developing cities went, to be very advanced and very important in culture and fashion. It was just kind of ahead of the time of almost anywhere else in the world at the time. It was basically the place to be in 1877, especially if you're from a tiny little village in Poland. Some speculate that George was drawn to London at this particular time as well because they did have a very large Polish population at the time. So George could have wanted to leave Poland and leave his family behind, but still be where he felt comfortable in these Polish communities that were all over London. When Severin went to London, that's when he started calling himself George. George ended up settling in the very popular West End part of London, and for some reason, he didn't even try to put his surgeon's apprentice skills to work. He immediately became a barber, and he went from barbershop to barbershop for employment, working at one, then going on to the next one and the next one. I have no idea why he was leaving these barbershops after only working for a few months. I don't know if he was getting fired or if he was just getting bored, but eventually he settled on a barbershop at the intersection of Whitechapel and High Streets, and he set up permanent employment here for quite a while. On August 7th, 1888, right near the barbershop that George was working at the time, at 2:30 in the morning, a prostitute named Martha Trabrin was murdered. This would become a recurring theme in the next 3 months, with 5 more women, all known prostitutes, to die in nearly the exact same way as each other, all within the general vicinity of George's barbershop. The press dubbed the killer of these women Jack the Ripper, and while all of this was going on, where he had set up home and employment, George's favorite pastime was to get extremely drunk to the point of inebriation and try to pick up and woo random women, prostitutes included. From what I could find, he wasn't a very picky man about who he let into his bed. One night, while George was doing just these two things, getting drunk to the point of inebriation and trying to woo young women into his bedchamber, George met a young woman who was also from Poland named Lucy Badesky. Despite George having a wife already that he left back in Poland, within 5 weeks of meeting Lucy, she and George were married. So apparently he turned on the charm, worked that wooing magic that he had in his drunken state, his drunken stupor, and talked Lucy right into his bedchamber and talked her into being his wife. Of course, she was none the wiser that he was already married. She would have had no way of knowing that. Lucy found out soon enough, however, that she was George's second wife because somehow the wife that he left back in Poland found out that he married Lucy almost immediately upon him marrying her. The old wife went and traveled to London to track down the newlyweds and to give George a piece of her mind, to get George to come back to Poland with her and to let Lucy Badesky know what was up, like, hey, he's already married. However, by the time she finally tracked them down, she found out that Lucy was already pregnant with George's child, and she just gave up and decided to let things be, and she went back to Poland. Lucy gave birth to her and George's first son in September of 1890. Unfortunately, though, the baby died of some unknown cause while he was still in his infancy, and this seemed to trigger George, and he started getting drunker and more violent, especially towards Lucy. George quickly gained a reputation around town as a drunkard and a woman beater, as not just his neighbors, but also his clients, the people that he hung around with. Pretty much everyone he knew and heard what he was doing to Lucy, the constant shouting, the beatings, Lucy constantly screaming for help, walking around with bruises. He gained a really terrible reputation for this around town. And back then, it was even worse than it is today for people like that. Not that it's very uncommon for men back in those days to go upside their wife's head whenever they wanted to, for whatever they felt like it. But I think a lot of men, I think George gained such a bad reputation because most men, or at least the majority of them, were a lot more discreet about what they were doing. George would just beat her right out in the open when she was in, his barber shop in front of his clients. He would beat her in front of neighbors. He didn't care who was around. If he wanted to hit her, slap her, he did what he wanted. He felt like that was his wife, that was his property, and he didn't care who saw it or what they said. Despite all of these things, or maybe because of them, George and Lucy decided that they wanted to make a fresh start of their relationship and try to work things out. They seemed to love each other despite George's crazy and violent behavior. So in 1891, they packed up their belongings and they moved to America. They settled in the state of New Jersey in the town of Jersey City. Upon arriving in Jersey City, New Jersey, George once again almost immediately found work as a barber in a nearby and local barber shop, but also almost immediately after arriving there, George began his violent, drunken tantrums and beatings against Lucy. Nothing had changed. You can't escape who you are, right? I mean, wherever you go, there you are. And unfortunately, the couple's fresh start wasn't a fresh start at all. It was the same old, same old. Unfortunately, even more for poor Lucy. In 1892, Lucy became pregnant again with the couple's second child, and even this didn't curb George's temper. He just seemed to be spurred on by it. He became even more violent. He got even more drunk. He became even more angry, to the point where one day a client came into the barber shop and found George in the back with Lucy pinned underneath him to the floor while he was punching her in the face over and over again, leaning over her pregnant belly. Thanks to the customer bursting in on them and distracting George, Lucy was able to run and finally escape the clutches of this violent and seemingly evil alcoholic man. This seemed to be the final straw for Lucy, though, as shortly thereafter, she returned by herself to London and decided to raise the baby up by herself. She went to live with her sister in Whitechapel and gave birth to a daughter in May of 1892. When George heard that his wife had given birth to their daughter, he decided to go back to Whitechapel, back to London, and try to reconcile with Lucy. However, Lucy had had enough. She was happy raising her daughter with the help of just her sister, and she completely turned George down. And realizing that it was hopeless, he felt defeated and went back to New Jersey. However, in 1893, for unknown reasons, he was back in England again. He started working in a new barber shop at this time in an area called Tottenham. Upon returning back to England, George met a woman named Annie Chapman, who was allegedly a known prostitute in the Whitechapel area. George was able to do what he had always done, and he wooed Annie with his talks of all of his travels to and from Poland, to America, to New Jersey. He seemed like a well-to-do and highly respected man. Apparently, Annie hadn't heard the rumors because within just a few weeks, the couple had moved in together. They told neighbors and their landlord that they were man and wife, as, you know, back then it was a scandal for a man and a woman to live together if they weren't married. We've covered this in other old-timey crime videos that I've done. It took less than a year, however, for Annie to see George's true colors. She left him. He would blatantly cheat on her in public in the tavern he worked in, right in front of her face. He would beat her violently in private and in public, up to his same old tricks. Finally, she'd had enough and she had left him. But in January of 1895, she realized she was pregnant with his baby and quickly returned to him, needing some kind of help. Annie really wanted a family. But upon telling George that she was pregnant with his child, he literally laughed in her face and told her that he would never be with her. They would never be a family. He didn't even think the baby was his. He didn't want her anymore, and basically told her to get lost. Somehow she managed to talk him into allowing her to stay with him so at least she could have the baby with the father present, with people still thinking they were married. However, George wanted nothing to do with being a father again. So he continued going out, continued cheating right in front of her face, continued treating her like crap, continued beating her even though she was pregnant, just as he had done with Lucy. And it took just a few weeks or a couple of months for Annie to decide enough is enough, and she left while pregnant with George's child. Despite the stigma put on single mothers back then, unwed single mothers, Annie felt she had no choice. Obviously, George wasn't willing to change. He had no intention of settling down and wanted nothing to do with having a family, whether it be with her or anyone else. Keep in mind, George and Annie were not legally married, despite what they had told everybody else and what everyone else thought. So Annie decided to leave George anyway, knowing that he would not be responsible for the baby in any way. There was no child support orders back then. He would not be financially responsible for this child. There wasn't DNA testing either. And of course, George was not going to man up. Again, he laughed in her face when she asked if he was going to help her with this child. Didn't want anything to do with her or the baby. The fact that she was willing to leave him anyway in this condition and knowing the consequences of these actions, that should really put into perspective how miserable life was for Annie with George Chapman. So, in 1895, George left Tottenham and went back to Whitechapel. So Tottenham was near Whitechapel, and that's where he was with Annie. Although technically he had already changed his name, not legally of course, but people had been calling him George for years now instead of Severin, he decided now to take on Annie's last name of Chapman and not go as Kozlowski anymore. So now his name was officially George Chapman to all who knew him. Despite the change of address and the change of his Despite the name change and the change of address, George was not changing anything else about himself, though. He continued his nightly dalliances with random women, betting a different one every single night, getting drunk to the point of inebriation, pretty much loving and leaving these women, feeling not bad about it at all, and just continuing on with his violent outbursts towards people, towards anyone who made him angry. Eventually, George moved again to another town near Whitechapel that I can't pronounce. I think it was called Leytonstone or something to that effect. Here he met a woman named Mary Spick, who was also kind of in a bad situation. Her husband had just left her and had taken her only child away from her. She was kind of out on her butt, kind of a wanderer. She had a really bad problem with alcoholism. She was an alcoholic, and that's why her son had left her and taken their child. So she was really in a bad way, the perfect kind of victim for George. Mary was 39 years old, and George was only 30 at this time. However, this made no difference to him because Mary was considered a very wealthy woman, as she had a 500-pound inheritance that she was left by her deceased grandfather. Obviously, George saw that money and decided that Mary was definitely the woman for him, no matter how old she was. And for that matter, no matter what her problems were. George eventually convinced Mary to buy him his own barbershop in the nearby seaside village of Hastings, with the couple very quickly moving in there together and telling everyone that they were a married couple, just as George had done with Annie Chapman. George's new barbershop brought in a ton of money, mainly because people loved this couple. They brought a grand piano, which Mary played for the customers. They sang, they danced, they pretty much wooed these customers with their charisma and their entertaining acts while the people were waiting to get their hair cut by George. George was extremely happy, but Mary wasn't so much. See, she wasn't in it for the money. She cared about George, and although this was a beautiful and quaint, quiet little town, she was used to the fast-paced life of London, and she desperately wanted to go back there. Because George refused to move with her, this caused Mary to become depressed and lonely, and she fell right back into the bottom of a bottle, drinking constantly, also to the point of inebriation. When she heard that George was cheating on her and stepping out with a woman that was very much younger than the both of them, named Alice Penfold, she confronted him, and the couple started fighting almost nonstop, constantly. Didn't matter who was around. Same old MO for George, and this was kind of the beginning of the end for them. Eventually, George decided to give in and move back to London with Mary. However, it wasn't because he had any interest in making her happy or because he wanted to give in to her wants and her needs. It had to do with the fact that he was already offered a job there running a very successful pub called the Prince of Wales, which was located on Old Street in London. So he had a very lucrative job offer waiting back for him in London, but he made it so that Mary thought it was because he loved and cared for her and cared about her happiness and well-being, but that wasn't the case at all. Mary really didn't care why. She was just happy to be back in London, and George was really happy too because he had grown accustomed to Whitechapel and he kind of loved the area. So they were both pretty content for a while to be back in Whitechapel, running a successful, not a barber shop, but a pub, a successful business again, and they were getting along a little bit better. Obviously, this happiness and getting along didn't last for a very long time because a violent alcoholic and his alcoholic partner running a pub that sells alcohol is not a very good idea. And this was exactly the setup. So eventually George started beating on her. She started fighting back with him, and they were up to their same old routine in no time. Mary was also diagnosed with tuberculosis at this time, and with there being no cure, no vaccine, she was just given medicine to make her as comfortable as possible until she passed on. George happily and dutifully administered the medicine whenever Mary wanted it, however he saw fit, seemingly helping her. This medicine was supposed to ease her pain, and George was responsible for mixing it, as sometimes she was too sick to even do just that. He seemed to be, by all accounts, a very giving and caring caretaker to Mary in her final days. On Christmas morning in 1897, Mary unfortunately succumbed to her illness and she passed away. She was buried before the new year even arrived. George seemed to be completely unaffected by his longtime partner and the person who most thought was his wife passing away. George seemed to be completely unaffected by his longtime partner and the woman who most people thought was his wife passing on. And just a few months later, in early 1898, George met another young woman named Bessie Taylor. He immediately went into his usual spiel of talking about his travels to Poland and America and what a well-to-do and cultured man he was to Bessie. And it wasn't long before the two moved in together and were telling people they were married. How many times is this guy going to pull this thing in the same neighborhood? How big is Whitechapel? Anyway, it worked. People thought that George had simply moved on and remarried after Mary had passed away from what everyone thought was tuberculosis. Just a few months after the couple moved in together, Bessie became sick, and she had the same symptoms that Mary had had before she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. So she seemed to be coming down with, or she seemed to have tuberculosis as well. She had many of the same symptoms. Thinking of change of scenery would do them some good, Bessie and George decided to move 40 miles north away from London to a town called Bishop's Stortford, where George started to run another already very successful pub called The Grapes. However, true to form, George spent most of his time here getting drunk, becoming violent, and sleeping with random women, and being violent towards Bessie, and the neighbors constantly heard them fighting, constantly saw bruises on Bessie. It was the same old, same old. The neighbors all thought that those two were married, and they did constantly hear him threatening to kill Bessie during their many, many drunken arguments. In the spring of 1899, I guess because once again, George's partner, this time Bessie, was so used to the hustle and bustle of London that living in a small, sleepy town like Bishop's Stortford, which was much more slow paced, she just wasn't happy. And George offered her a change of scenery and said that maybe that would make her physically feel better and maybe it would do the two of them some good so they can stop their arguing and he wouldn't be drinking so much, yada, yada, yada. But the real reason they moved back to London in the spring of 1899 is because George was offered yet another job running yet another very successful pub called the Monument Tavern. This guy's life is like on repeat. It's like Groundhog Day, the same thing over and over again, just with a different woman with a different name. For a little while, the couple did get along better after moving back to London, and Bessie seemed physically to be feeling much better too, as well as being in much better spirits. George wasn't drinking as much, and they were, as I said, getting along much better. But this only lasted a very short while before, in December of 1900, Bessie got really, really ill again. She became very, very sick, and the doctors basically told her there was nothing they could do for her. They didn't really know what was ailing her, but they knew that she was dying. So once again, they gave George the medicine to administer to his wife, and he dutifully did so without complaint and tried to make her as comfortable as possible until she passed on, which she did in February of 1901, on Valentine's Day to be exact. February 14th, 1901, Bessie Taylor had passed away. Her cause of death was listed as exhaustion due to all the vomiting and diarrhea she had to deal with in the last few months of her life, but there were no postmortems done back then, unless specifically requested because someone thought a murder had taken place. But what I want to know is, okay, she died from exhaustion from the vomiting and diarrhea that she had had for months on end, seemingly without stop, but what caused the vomiting and diarrhea? It seems nobody asked this question, and Bessie Taylor was buried. George quickly moved on as he hired an 18-year-old pretty girl named Maude Marsh. George hired her as the barmaid and then immediately went into the same old routine, talking to her of his travels to America, to Poland, and about what a well-to-do man he was, how he could have been a surgeon, how he had the skills, yada, yada, yada. However, Maude Marsh made it known from the door that their relationship would be nothing but professional and nothing untoward would happen between she and George unless George put a ring on it. She was saving herself for marriage. She wasn't that kind of girl, and she was not going to follow in the footsteps of her many predecessors. George was going to have to work for this one, and he was going to have to marry her if he wanted anything other than a professional relationship with her, which seemingly he did, although I think this was just another conquest. It was kind of like the thrill of the chase, but that's just what it seems like to me. Let me know in the comments if you agree. In October of 1901, just 8 months after his longtime partner and who most people thought was his wife, Bessie Taylor, died from some kind of unknown sickness or illness, George Chapman and Maude Marsh did in fact marry. For a while, it seemed Maude and George had a really great relationship, a really great marriage. They got along really well. They hardly ever argued. But as we know, old habits die hard. And it wasn't that long before George was up to his usual tricks again. This time with his victim being 18, maybe 19-year-old at this point, Maude Marsh. It seemed like George was up to his old tricks again, not just with the main woman in his life, but also in other areas as well. A few weeks before the lease was to run out on the tavern that George was running, a random fire started and the place nearly burned to the ground, but there was still enough of the structure left for the insurance company to run an investigation. They decided it was arson. They knew that George had said it but couldn't prove it, so they would not pay out the insurance money. They couldn't press charges against George. As I said, there was no proof, but everyone pretty much knew he had done it because the lease was running out and he wanted the insurance money. However, he didn't get it. They were on to him. They just had no proof. He basically had to just take it as a loss, which obviously he was not happy about, and he took it out on Maude. It was at this point that George is said to have seriously considered taking Maude to New Jersey to the United States, but for one reason or another, he decided to take on running and managing another successful pub, of which I do not know the name. So he and Maude set everything up and moved in together near the pub shortly after his old one was burned and inoperable. For whatever reason, probably because George was ready to move on, Maude was not hired on as the bartender or the barmaid in this new tavern, and George hired a different, much younger, and maybe prettier, more attractive woman to fill this role. However, Maude was feisty. She wasn't like her predecessors in really any way. Maude Marsh wasn't going to be cheated on and left with nothing. She had a lot of family that was there for her, that supported her, that did not like George Chapman, and specifically her mother and sister. And she knew she had somewhere to go. It was her money that they were running all these pubs with, that they were basically living off of, and she just wasn't having it. So she told him in no uncertain terms, you will get rid of this young woman and give me my job so I can work beside you, or I'm leaving. Maude was like, to the left, to the left. I couldn't help myself, okay? Unfortunately, before Maude can follow through with this threat, she became ill with some mysterious illness, seemingly with the same symptoms as two of George's previous ex-partners. She had the symptoms, the same severe stomach pain, the vomiting, the nausea, the diarrhea, the inability to really do anything except sit there and take the medication that George was given to mix and distribute to her as needed to try and get her better. So it didn't look good for old Maude. However, almost immediately upon seeing her symptoms, seeing how sick she was, Maude's mother rushed her to the hospital, where she stayed for a couple of weeks and was professionally treated by medical professionals. And she was 100% better in a few weeks after she left the hospital and gone home. But George seemed to some to be angry about this, and he started really very, very violently beating on Maude, getting drunker and drunker night by night, cheating on her, doing all of the same things. You know what I mean? Some people never change, and George Chapman is one of those people. It seemed like the angrier and more violent George got towards Maude, the sicker she would become. So her mother decided to move in and keep a watchful eye over what was going on with her daughter, with the sickness, and with the couple. It didn't deter George in any way, but the mother noticed that every time George would prepare Maude's either food or medicine or both, she would become even more sick. On October 21st, 1902, while George was mixing and preparing tonics and medicines that he told Maude's mother he had gotten from the local doctor, Maude's mother somehow intercepted these medications and tonics, and George was not able to administer them to Maude. The mother got her hands on them. Mrs. Marsh decided that she was going to sample some of the medications and tonics to see if her suspicions about her son-in-law were correct. It didn't take long for her suspicions to be confirmed, because almost immediately upon sampling or trying these medications and tonics, Mrs. Marsh became sick with the same exact symptoms as Maude and George's previous two lovers. Her suspicions in her mind were absolutely confirmed that George was the one making and keeping her daughter Maude sick, and that possibly he had done the same thing to his previous two lovers, companions. However, it was too late. The next day, on October 22nd, Maude Marsh Chapman passed away of her illness. Upon the arrival of the doctor, Mrs. Marsh, Maude's mother, told him about her little experiment with the medicines and tonics, and the doctor believed her and immediately also became suspicious of George. As I said earlier, postmortems weren't just done. They had to be ordered by, one of the coroners or a detective. I don't know exactly how it worked, but this coroner decided he would not sign the death certificate, and he would not be putting a ruling of the cause of death until a post-mortem was performed on Maude Marsh Chapman. Thank goodness for this woman's mother. Thank goodness for Mrs. Marsh. George was extremely angry and acted very insulted, as he was a man in high standing, as was his wife Maude. And even though everyone knew of his violent temper, he didn't believe anyone would believe that he was a murderer, someone who poisoned people. Despite George's vehement objections, though, the doctor wasn't hearing any of it. He wanted a more precise cause of death for Maude, and he ordered the postmortem and all the tests to be done to see the exact cause of death. Of course, very unusually large amounts of arsenic and other poisons that were popular back in the day were found in Maude's system, and just 3 days later, on October 25th, 1902, George Chapman was arrested and charged with the murder of Maude Marsh. The coroner then ordered for the bodies of George's ex-wife Mary and his longtime partner Bessie Taylor to be exhumed and examined, and of course the very same poisons were found in both of their bodies. Everyone thought George would soon be standing trial for all three of these women's murders. However, George seemed to be one step ahead of the police, because when they searched his pub and apartment, they found no poison, no traces of poison, really nothing that can link him to the deaths. They didn't find the medicines or the tonics that Mrs. Marsh had seen George giving her daughter. I don't know why Mrs. Marsh didn't keep some of the medicines and tonics to turn over to the coroner or the police. I did search for that information, but I couldn't find out why. You'd think someone who was so thorough and she was so worried about her daughter and willing to prove that this man was trying to kill her daughter, that she voluntarily drank what she was pretty sure was poison to prove herself, yet she didn't keep any of the evidence. As smart as he thought he was, though, by getting rid of any of the evidence, or so he thought, George did not get rid of the receipts of purchase for these poisons, and the police soon found them hidden in a ledger in the inside of the pub George was running. They arrested him, they charged him with the murder of all three women again, and he would soon be standing trial. The police were looking for a first-degree murder conviction, which was punishable by hanging. On March 16th, 1903, the trial of George Chapman started. For some reason, he was only being charged with the murder of Maude Marsh. The prosecution felt they had a lot of circumstantial evidence, especially in the witness testimony, the character witnesses. They called many of them, and every single person that they called told stories of George's violent behavior, his angry outbursts, the beatings that he would give to the women in his life, just that he was an all-around bad guy. He was a drunkard, he was a liar, a scam artist, and mainly a woman beater. He was also a charlatan and went from woman to woman, constantly cheating on his wife blatantly in public. These kinds of things were not admired in a man back then, even though I think secretly when men got together, they were admired. This wasn't something that you did publicly. Again, I say, you were supposed to be discreet about it. Something like everyone knows, but they don't tell kind of thing. And George did not follow that. And he did it blatantly, publicly, and he did not care what people thought or said or felt about it. And this all came back to bite and haunt him when these character witnesses were called to testify on behalf of the prosecution, on behalf of Maude Marsh Chapman. Something weird that came up was when the prosecution tried to make their case about George being a liar and a scam artist, just an all-around bad person who couldn't be believed when he said anything, let alone when he said he was innocent and not guilty of these crimes, of this crime. When the prosecution told the witnesses, the jury, the court, the judge, that George's real name was Severin Klosowski, George vehemently denied this. He denied it almost more than he denied being a murderer. For some reason, he never admitted that this was his birth name, his legal name, his given name, and he said that he didn't even know who that person was, that there was no proof that that was him, and he did not know what the prosecution was talking about. I mean, that really has nothing to do with the murder of Maude Marsh or these other women, but I just thought it was interesting that he would so vehemently deny this. Like, he was really angry that this was even brought up in the first place. George Chapman protested his innocence throughout the entire trial. However, 4 days after it began, the murder trial for George Chapman ended with the jury taking only 11 minutes to find him guilty of murder. He was sentenced, of course, to hang. For some reason, which we'll never know, George's first wife, Lucy, tried to visit him numerous times while he was awaiting his death sentence to be carried out while he was in prison. However, he always claimed that he didn't know her and refused to see her because she knew him as Severin Klosowski, and if he saw her, people thought, at least this is why he wouldn't see her, that would be admitting that he had lied throughout the entire trial, and he wasn't willing to admit that his real name was Severin Klosowski. So he never saw Lucy, and nobody ever knew what she was trying to visit him for. On April 7th, 1903, George Chapman was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison, expressing his innocence the entire time, never admitting to any wrongdoing, seeking any kind of forgiveness, and he definitely never admitted to poisoning at least 3 women. He proclaimed his innocence until the end. The last thing I want to talk about is why George Chapman is a Jack the Ripper suspect. Could he possibly be the infamous and still unknown serial killer? During the fall and winter of 1888, the man who ran the investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders name was Inspector Abilene. Upon arresting George for the murder of Maude Marsh, Inspector Abilene gave a very public and very big congratulations to the police because he informed them that, in his opinion, the police had just also arrested Jack the Ripper. The inspector also reported in the local newspaper that he believed Jack the Ripper had been arrested and that he was George Chapman. He pointed to the fact that George Chapman was an extremely skilled surgeon's assistant and had a ton of medical knowledge due to his extensive schooling. He also lived in Whitechapel at the time all of the murders took place, and in fact, his arrival in the capital coincided with the beginning of the Ripper murders. He also, as we know now, took the last name of Annie Chapman, who was one of the canonical 5 Ripper victims. Some people think these 5 women were the only victims of Jack the Ripper, with others thinking that Jack killed many more. If you guys want, I can do a whole case on Jack the Ripper. I would love to. Serial killers and history are, in fact, my thing, as most of you know, if you've been with me for a while. So let me know in the comments about what you think about this case, if you think he was the Ripper, and if you want me to deep dive into Jack the Ripper. Anyways, why else do people sometimes think, and why did Inspector Abilene think, that George was Jack the Ripper? After this information was made public in the newspapers by Inspector Abilene, many witnesses came forth and said that, in fact, George was known to roam the streets of Whitechapel at night, dressed the same way the Ripper was dressed. All hours of the middle of the night, everyone knew he frequented prostitutes. So he was seen around the areas where these women were murdered at the time they were murdered, and he was constantly wandering around, and he definitely fit in by the way that he dressed. He was a man of good standing in the community, so nobody would have noticed or thought it was him. He could have been found right next to a body. That's how it worked back then. But after this came out, a lot of people became suspicious and did come forward and tell the inspector and the police that he was known for doing this. I managed to come across a little known fact about why some people think George is Jack the Ripper, and I've studied Jack the Ripper extensively. I've studied and researched most of the suspects, including George Chapman, before this, but this is a fact that I didn't know, so I'm going to share it with you today, and maybe you could learn something new. When George left London to move to New Jersey in 1891, a prostitute named Carrie Brown was murdered in Jersey City on April 24th of that same year. And George was there. He was living in Jersey City. He was known to frequent prostitutes. Okay, so a Ripper-style murder of this prostitute. She was staying at a lodge, and she was seeing Johns there. So a lot of people think that George Chapman was that John. He was in the area. He lived in the same city. As many of us in the true crime community know, though, there are so many Jack the Ripper suspects, and theories abound as to why each of them may or may not be the Ripper. I don't know if we'll ever know. I really hope that we do one day. But until then, I'm Gemma Jade, and I really hoped that you enjoyed this story, this case. I love the old time cases. I hope that the views go up in them so I can continue doing them. If you don't want me to continue with this into the month of December, let me know. Give me some suggestions. I have a lot of content coming up. If you did not catch my live stream last night, on Missing Persons and Mysteries when I was live with Steve Stockton. Please go and check that out. Also, our podcast premiered yesterday, Strange Things with Steve Stockton and Gemma Jade. It's in the live stream. The link is in the live stream from last night on the Missing Person and Mysteries channel. I don't have the link right this minute to put it in the description box, but within a day or two, I will have it in there. So if you can't find it, you can just go into YouTube and search Strange New Jersey or Strange Things. We did talk about Strange New Jersey on the live stream, and that was our first episode of the podcast. I'm really proud of it. We could definitely use a lot more subscribers and viewers on Strange Things with Steve Stockton and Gemma Jade. Please go check that out, guys. Please support me. Also, be sure to like this video, comment on it. You know I love talking to you. I try my best, and I think I have gotten back to every single comment that was ever sent my way. You can also email me at gemmajadeYT@gmail.com. I'll put it up on the screen. Subscribe if you haven't already. Go to my podcast, subscribe there. Check the live stream out on Missing Persons and Mysteries. It was a really great time. It was my first ever guest appearance on a live stream. Doing big thing, guys. Also, to donate to financially support the channel, as I am not monetized on this channel, I am receiving no money from anything yet, and I do this full time, researching, scripting, filming, editing, and being a stay-at-home mama. You guys know my time is limited, and I take it and give to you doing something that I love. This is a full-time job for me. So if you are able to, and want to support me and the channel financially, click the PayPal me link in the description box, and the money will go directly into my account and directly back into the channel. I need some new equipment, a background, obviously. So if you're able to do that, great. If you're not, I love you anyway. I always tell you guys, be kind to each other. It doesn't cost anything, and it can gain you so much. You never know how your words, your actions affect somebody else. You don't know where someone else is in their head. So please be kind, be decent, don't judge. One more thing I want to talk to my previous subscribers about, my subscribers that have been with me all along. The hot mess recovery stuff is going on a separate channel. As you can probably see, I privatized some of the videos because there was too much personal information. When I started this channel, I wasn't thinking long term. I was thinking my intentions are everybody's intentions, and I don't want all that extremely personal information out there about where I live and, you know, just certain things I put out there that I really shouldn't have. There are stalkers, there are bad people with bad intentions, and I got to remember that. So the videos are privatized now. I'm either going to redo them or go back in and just edit out the personal information. So please don't be upset about that. And in a week or two, maybe sooner, you will not see the hot mess recovery, addiction and recovery videos on this channel anymore. I'm going to move them to hot mess recovery, and I'll leave the link for that in whatever video comes before that's description box. I hope you guys go over there and subscribe to that as well, and stick with me here for true crime. I'm also going to be starting eventually within the next coming months a podcast of my true crime videos. I know a lot of you listen, so that could be a hookup for you. So you don't have to watch the video, you can listen to it on whatever format you listen to your podcasts on. I don't know the technical terms, I'm still learning. So with this incredibly long outro, don't forget the PayPal me link is in the description box to donate to the channel. Like, subscribe, comment, hello to all my new subscribers, and don't forget to check out the live stream and the podcast Strange Things with Steve Stockton and Gemma Jade. Be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time. Mwah. Bye-bye.